On behalf of Beyond Trust and Carasoft, we would like to welcome you to today's podcast, focused around aligning ICAM, the executive order, and zero trust for the Defense Department. We're Josh Broadbent, RVP of Public Sector Solutions Engineering with Beyond Trust, Major General Joe Brenler from the U.S. Army and Deepwater Point, and Stephen M. Wallace, Systems Innovation Scientist of the Emerging Technology Directorate from DISA. We'll discuss why privileged access management is essential to major DoD initiatives like ICAM, Thunderdome, and Zero Trust, how ICAM supports the executive order, the Defense Department's outlook on data-centric security in defending agency systems, and the path to secure modernization using least privilege.
Today's format's going to be a little bit of a fireside chat format that I have some questions that I'm going to ask Steve and Joe as we walk through this. But first, before we do that, I'll start with you, Steve. Do you want to give a little bit of background on yourself and, just give a brief introduction, and then we'll move on to Joe for that as well.
Sure. So I'm Steve Wallace. I'm the CTO as well as the Director of Emerging Technology here at DISA. So I sort of wear two hats. One is in that CTO role, trying to drive technology adoption and the overall technical strategy for the agency across the board, as well as try to make sure and take care of our technical staff in general. And then the other side is that emerging technology side of the house, where we're looking at new and creative technologies that cover the whole gamut of the agency's needs and frankly the department's as well. So thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Always glad to have you, Steve. Joe, how about you? Why don't you introduce yourself?
Thanks. Yeah, I'm Joe Brenler. I spent a little bit under 32 years on active duty in the U.S. Army, and then I transitioned out, spent a year hiking the Appalachian Trail, and then started consulting in 2018. Over the course of the last 10 years of my assignments, I served in U.S. Cybercom, where I actually retired as Chief of Staff as a Major General in 2016 in December. Prior to that, I had been in the Pentagon at the headquarters of the Department of the Army in the office of the CIO G6 as a director and sort of number two in military rank in that organization. And before that, in Afghanistan as a senior U.S. official with C5ISR systems responsibilities, including cybersecurity. And before that, I was the director of the Defense Information Systems Agency, Steve's our current organization. So I'm a proud alumnus from that perspective. I mentioned in my case, Josh, I retired out off of active duty into consulting, and it was during the time I was hiking on the Appalachian Trail that I grew my beard, but I went directly to gray. So, and I'm happy to be here.
Well, we're glad to have you, Joe. Thank you so much for making time for us today. Just as a finish that off, I am Josh Broadbent. My role here at Beyond Trust is the RVP of Solutions Engineering for the public sector. I have over 20 years of experience in IT. I've architected 3 million user accounts, solutions for identity and access management. So I've been around the block from the industry side a few times. For those of you that are out there, with that, we'll kind of kick today off. So I'm going to start this question for either one of you that want to take it. There's been a lot of focus on cybersecurity prioritization from agency and federal leadership. How has this affected the Defense Department's cybersecurity priorities or modernization efforts?
So I guess I can jump on that one, at least initially. So I would say that I'd start with the fact that we've always had a focus in this space, right? I would say it's changed and evolved over time, and I know we're going to get into a little bit more of this later, but it went from a very network-centric approach to things a few years ago and has evolved now into more of a, all the way up the OSI model to more of a data-centric approach to the problem of cybersecurity. I mean, prior to coming to the department, as an outsider, I actually always admired what the department had with the Common Access Card and that basic foundation of identity there is now a renewed push to how do we better exploit that identity? How do we, use that as more of the core of our, cybersecurity architecture going forward?
Okay. Joe, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate the fact that Steve was willing to jump on that one, as you had asked the question as Department of Defense's priorities. So I appreciate the fact that he can actually comment on that authoritatively as a member of the current executive branch, whereas I am now a partner at Deepwater Point, but I'm no longer on active duty. I have my opinions, and I'm happy to share them with you. I believe that everyone is entitled to my opinion. But on this particular point, I would say that the current environment constitutes a very vocal expression of a reduction in risk tolerance where it comes to cybersecurity, because there's been an increasing appreciation for the consequences of not addressing that appropriately.
Fair enough. Steve, I liked what you said about that foundational identity that we have in CACs, specifically around the Department of Defense. And I know you and I have had conversations. I'm a big proponent of ICAM sitting at the heart of a zero trust strategy, and that identity sitting at the heart of a zero trust strategy. What does that mean to you or to some of the new emerging programs that you are working on at DISA?
So, absolutely, wholeheartedly agree. Right, when we talk about the 7 pillars of a zero trust type architecture, identity is certainly one of them. But we always stress that identity is probably the bigger pillar, right? It's the more ornate pillar, and it's frankly the most important. And that ability to lay down that foundation, and then how do we expand upon it? I mean, DISA's had some ICAM work going on for quite a while. The renewed push came about 1.5 years, 2 years ago. And to be quite frank, over the last 20 years that I've been in this space, I've watched a number of starts and evolutions of capability. What's different this time is, frankly, the department in any large organization often struggles with the attributes around the user, the timeliness, the quality, those sorts of things. We're taking a slightly different approach this time by using some workflow capabilities and to sort of generate and keep those attributes refreshed. But I'd probably say that's the sort of the key and what's going to make this one an even larger success this time and move the ball a little bit further down the field.
Okay. Joe, real quick transitioning, what's your take on the executive order or the new national security memorandum? Not necessarily new, but I mean, as is all things in government, if it's happened in the last year, it's probably new. So the NSM 8, what's your take on those and how that should shift mandates or priorities or strategy, how those mandates should shift your priorities and strategy inside the DoD?
Yeah, so I think you may recall the last time we had a webinar conversation about this. I responded to your questions regarding the difference between top-down direction and a bottoms-up approach to modernization and so forth. And this is significant in that it constitutes top-down direction, which is necessary in order to establish standards from a conformance or compliance perspective across the department. The executive order, of course, establishes the understanding that it's important to prioritize the resourcing of these initiatives, not just the talking about it, because otherwise they are simply unfunded mandates. And the expression of the importance from the President of the United States in talking about that, I think, is really important. The National Security Memorandum, it seems to me, continues that same message within the national security community. And the fact that it aligns most strongly with Section 3 of the executive order kind of gives it some focus. And it has additional focus on what we call national security systems, those that could contain classified information or have great importance to critical functions with regard to our collective security. So it's clearly of great importance and therefore priority for all of us.
Great. Thank you, Joe, for that answer. Steve, did you have something to add to that?
But just to sort of foot stomp what Joe was talking about there, especially around the resourcing, right? So it does require the realignment of some resourcing. It does require, capital in order to get things moving and make it happen. There's nothing but goodness in either of those, the executive order or the NSM 8. And we were already poised and moving in that direction. So now we're looking at how do we evolve capabilities, augment capabilities, or flat out replace capabilities, going forward. And to your point about, a year seems fresh. These things do take time. The government works in 5-year cycles. So it takes us some time to work through it, but I'm actually seeing it happen pretty rapidly. And it's also about, I'd say the last thing that, to you all and anyone listening, this is not a fast or overnight or big bang sort of event where, you can point at a calendar and say, yep, we're going to be done these things, by this specific date. Security has always been about a cat and mouse game. And so it's always going to continue to evolve. Where we are today, we shouldn't be in 5 years. And 5 years after that, we shouldn't be in that same place. And it shouldn't stop. And you really can't declare victory, frankly, across any of these. Or you shouldn't declare victory across any of these, because you should be looking for where the next threat's coming from.
Absolutely. Thanks, Steve. And I'm going to kind of return to you. How did Thunderdome come about? What's the premise behind this? And I know everyone, that's their thing that they love to ask you about, but I figure we take 30 seconds and at least acknowledge that part of it.
Sure. So it really came from a place of us looking at where we were trying to go with the Joint Regional Security Stacks, or JRSS, how that needed to evolve. It's JRSS takes a lot of heat for the way that it's been deployed and some of the capabilities and that kind of thing. The reality is the department has better visibility than what we've ever had before, and much of that is frankly thanks to JRSS. It allowed us to centralize, get a better view of things. But frankly, JRSS is very thinking OSI model again. 1 to 4, right? When you try going above that, those defenses are very network centric. They're not application centric. So we were trying to think through how that can evolve, and also at the same time attempting to middle traffic and break and inspect it, trying to deduce what's going on, put conversations back together, look for anomalous behavior. Very difficult trying to sit in the middle. We were watching industry move in the direction of pushing that enforcement to both ends, both the user as well as the data side of things. And Thunderdome really came from the place of, how do we start to get after that? It's not the holistic going to solve all of the world's ills, and we're really looking for partnership with industry to help us even move beyond kind of where we're targeting with Thunderdome. But it came from a really cool place of sort of that old fashioned, a bunch of folks sitting around trying to getting in front of a whiteboard and trying to take apart a problem, and really excited to see how far it's come and where it's about to go.
Okay, awesome. Joe, from your perspective, how does agency modernization with expanding cloud deployments and distributed workforces, how does that create new areas for adversaries to exploit?
Yeah, from my point of view, Josh, you can look at where we are in this and those very subjects that you mentioned. The Department of Defense has been increasingly adopted cloud as the location for its compute and store components of overall infrastructure solutions. And as it's done that, it has essentially had to redefine the way it thinks about what constitutes the perimeter of the Department of Defense information networks. So the perimeter of the DoDIN, if you will, it's been forced to change in this way. that increases attack surface as a first response to your question, specifically with regard to adversaries. And if you look at the way that over the last couple of years, there's been an increasing adoption because foremost for the reasons of a response to the pandemic, to placing our workforce in remote work locations. That also constitutes an expansion of what we would have defined as the perimeter of the DOTN. So once again, you have expanded attack surface. You also have created new seams where different parts of the architecture interconnect, and those transitional locations typically constitute places where you have to make a decision about whether you trust what's coming and going to do so. And that's a place that, if it's not managed properly, the adversary can exploit now that it didn't exist before. So we've opened a new hole for them in that way, potentially, if we didn't do it right.
Steve, this is for you, and I promise I planted this question. How can agencies leverage identity and privilege access management to combat threat actors? Why are IAM and PAM so important when thinking about zero trust or a Thunderdome strategy looking forward?
Sure. So a lot of folks focus on the identity and access management side, the general user base problem, right? And admittedly, we've had to balance that ourselves in how we want to attack the problem. So we focus on the user accesses a machine or touches a machine, which crosses the wire, accesses data ultimately within the application, and you want to make sure that they have the proper authorizations and that kind of thing. On the back end, we want to make sure that the folks that are managing those systems and ultimately have access to a lot of that data as well are restricted and maintained and only have access to the things that they should for whatever given period of time and for the very specific purpose or activity that they need. So that they both have their unique places, both IAM and PAM. It's your PAM community is always going to be far smaller. At least I hope and I pray that it is a far smaller community. Although I'm sure there's probably folks out there, maybe it's not. But your privileged user community should be a whole heck of a lot smaller. But they're the targets of all the attacks, right? If I pop an account and I sort of work my way up, we've seen it many times. I work my way up in terms of privilege until I get to the very top of that food chain. To the most privileged user, and then I potentially do bad things. So we've got to make sure that we defend those identities in a very different way. But they are obviously more valuable than even just your regular general population, if you will.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And of course, that's a spot where I definitely agree with you on both counts, right? That they should be a smaller subset of your population, but it's definitely where attacks happen. So having that privilege account management to cover those particular threat vectors is absolutely paramount to an agency's overall zero trust strategy. And kind of as a sub question to that, privilege accounts are clearly that subset of accounts, and they're given the highest set of privileges to perform a task. So let's talk a little bit about least privilege in that with those privileged accounts. How does least privilege affect those controls, and why is that so important?
Yeah. Okay, sure. So I mean I think for some of the reasons that we had already touched on, right? I mean it's you want to have those accounts, and when we talk about least privilege, it's not just the specific systems or files or what have you that user has access to. It's also around potentially locations or time of day or any of those other attributes about that user session that need to be bound, right? But you can't make it so inflexible that it falls apart in the moment of crisis either, and that's a really careful thing that you have to watch. That as security professionals, we have a bad habit locking things down as tightly as humanly possible, and then a bad day comes, and then you're struggling to get the job done because you're outside of one of those parameters. So there's certainly that balance there that needs to be struck. But no, I mean, we're big fans of the use of a privileged access approach separate from your traditional ICAM sort of approach.
Awesome. It's great to hear you say that, obviously. Joe, do you have any thoughts on how and why implementing least privilege is so important for those privileged access accounts?
Yeah, I want to actually, Josh, start by circling back to foot stomp some of the comments that Steve made earlier when you were asking what does zero trust mean to him. And from my perspective, that's inclusive of the notion that we have to presume compromise. That we have to expect that there's no such thing as a perfectly secure system. If you wanted to try to make one, you would have to destroy the system rather than use it. And if you want to use it, you have to expect that it's going to be insecure in at least some ways, and that adversaries are going to find ways to exploit that. So you start with the presumption of compromise and work from there. You never, therefore, just trust what is being requested. You explicitly verify. And those are the words that the Defense Information Systems Agency has been using in how it has described its work on Thunderdome and so forth, and on implementation of its zero trust reference architecture. You also have to understand that you're not starting from scratch as you're undertaking a new implementation necessarily. You have to deploy improvements on top of an existing capability. And the choices about what to modernize, what not to modernize, what to replace, what not to replace are essential to that. And in the case of the implementation of zero trust principles in accordance with the organizational scheme that is set out in the architecture established with pillars, as we've discussed before, identity is one of the foundational pillars. It's not the only one. The user / identity pillar is the one that we're focusing on when we're talking about an adversary taking advantage of an opportunity to appear to be an ordinary user, one that is actually authorized to be there. And if it's not possible to distinguish them based on credentials or behavior or a combination of these things, then we can't prevent them from doing bad things. And when an adversary has an opportunity, because we're not looking at their behavior or continuously verifying their identity with multiple factors for authentication, it makes it hard for us to make the decision about authorization, whether they should be allowed to do what they're requesting. And in that, from where I started with the notion of presumed compromise, they're already in, they look like an ordinary user. We have to expect that they're going to want to escalate privileges in order to be able to do more damage. The implementation of a PAM solution makes it harder for them to do damage in the first place, with least principles applied to them based on who we think they are. And then it also makes it harder for them to accomplish the escalation of privileges to do more damage while appearing to be someone with the higher privileges.
Yeah, that's a great perspective. In fact, as you were kind of walking through that, it reminded me of a conversation that Steve and I have had previously. And I don't, everybody on these types of panels, they'll beat the history of breaches over the past couple of years to death. But Steve also offered an interesting perspective in one of our last conversations around how zero trust principles actually ultimately discovered those breaches. Steve, do you want to, I know that's not one of the questions that we talked about beforehand, but do you want to elaborate on that just a little bit?
Yeah, because frankly, I remember the conversation well, and I love this story. So, it was, there was a lot of talk around SolarWinds, and quite frankly, and this is, I mean this in the kindest of ways, but after SolarWinds, we had quite a number of vendors come to us and say how they could have prevented the SolarWinds attack, either through sensing or this or that or the other thing. What many folks know, a lot of folks also don't know, though, is that the SolarWinds attack was actually detected via an ICAM, or a multi-factor authentication policy, when a user was alerted to the fact that they were trying to log in and they got an MFA request on their device. So SolarWinds wasn't necessarily found by some really excellent sensor. Although, had we known what we were looking for, that kind of thing, there were likely anomalies sitting out there that were missed. But it was actually determined through a strong ICAM policy, which I've always found pretty interesting. You never like to use the user as a sensor, but here's a place where it actually showed to work really well.
Yeah, I enjoyed that story when you told it, and I think it's a good point that a lot of people miss around that conversation is ultimately, these series of breaches are things that have conversation that bring up that zero trust concept, right? These are the reasons why we have to assume that we're breached and that we explicitly verify. But I also find it interesting when good identity stories and good security posture and policies are ultimately what do the job and prevent the things they're supposed to prevent. So I really enjoy that story. Joe, just kind of from your perspective, how do you see privileged access management fitting into the overall objectives of ICAM?
Yeah, so as I was saying, Josh, within the context of a zero trust reference architecture, ICAM has a foundational role. We want to be able to authenticate the users who are trying to employ our systems, and we want to decide whether they should be authorized to do what they need to do. This is the job of identity, credential, and access management functionally, is to make those decisions. It's two different decisions, and that's one of the things which makes it complex. One is, are they who they say they are? And the other is, do they have a need to know or do what they're asking to know or do? That's access to data, or it's access to other systems. And the privileged access management bounds that by constraining, if we do decide that they are who they say they are, then what are they allowed to do, and reduce the risk that that's going to be more than we would like them to be doing.
Thank you. I appreciate that answer, and absolutely, that's our perspective as well. And we look at it just like ICAM kind of plays a foundational pillar in zero trust. That really, your privileged access users are a lot of times the users that have access to those ICAM solutions that have controlling privileges. So it's also foundational to an effective ICAM strategy. So I absolutely like the way that you phrase that. Speaking of ICAM, Joe, I'm going to come back to you. Are there really any updates on agencies using ICAM, and what's the focus for agency adoption right now?
Well, I'm going to speak aspirationally first rather than factually. I think aspirationally, the focus is an interoperable identity credential access management solution across the entirety of the federal government, not just the Department of Defense, but absolutely at least across the entire Department of Defense. And right now, factually, we don't know for 100% whether there is going to be one solution that is produced and delivered by DISA, or there are going to be multiple solutions produced and delivered by the agencies, the services, and DISA. My expectation is that because of what constitutes its current raison d'etre, DISA is going to have to focus on the fourth estate. And they have said about things like Thunderdome and JWCC that they don't intend to mandate that all of DoD employ the solution that they come up with. So from my perspective, Josh, I think aspirationally, the interoperability among the solutions chosen by the different implementers is going to be absolutely necessary.
That's a great point. And, it's something that TechNet Cyber was last week as we have conversations both in industry and with our agency peers. It's something that the conversation comes up over and over again, right? It's not just what tool you have, but it's how it integrates. It's how that tool stack becomes one particular tool set. Speaking of tool sets, and that kind of multitude of technologies that compromise that make up enterprise ICAM solutions. Um, so last week was TechNet, and Steve, you had a great panel there. Interoperability was frequently mentioned as a priority during that panel discussion. What criteria will DISA use in selecting tools to ensure that kind of optimal interoperability?
I don't know that we've nailed down all of that yet. And part of that I think is going to be some discussion with industry about what is the art of the possible, right? So we talked a lot about interoperability, and quite frankly, from the very inception of Thunderdome, it's the thing that has probably weighed on me most. The department and Joe's been there with us. The department oftentimes it's a federated IT architecture, right? There's at the network level there's a lot more integration, but as you move up, it becomes far more federated in our approach to things. And we had some internal dialogue early on about, okay, do we want to have the larger conversation with the department about, hey, let's get onto one, let's decide on one given technology. And frankly, that would take a lot of time. There's a lot of very valid opinions, as you move throughout the department. And the larger the audience, the more time that debate takes, if you will. So what we decided to do is we moved out in the direction of Thunderdome, and our goal is, to your point, we're not trying to mandate, we're not asking that anyone mandate the adoption of Thunderdome across the board. Our goal is to create a solution that is strong enough and useful enough to the department that others will want to join and jump on it, right? We've seen time and time again when IT architectures are dictated, they don't fit every possible every possible situation out there, if you will. So it's often hard. You get into a lot of compromises when you start to move in that direction of necessarily dictating an architecture. However, again, if we feel that we can field something strong enough, while we are targeting the fourth estate, we've written the OTA in such a way that it is extensible to the entire department, and we look forward to how we can integrate with existing solutions that are already out there. That I often kind of go back when we talk about interoperability. I worry that there's very much a lack of standards in this space, and oftentimes when you look at standards that are out there, I mean, you need. I got my cell phone sitting right next to me, right? And while I have an iOS device right next to me, I also have an Android device over there for you Android fans. I when I send a text, to some of my friends that have Android devices, right, and you see the bubble go green, and you see the pictures that you send get degraded, right? You're stepping down to whatever that legacy standard is. It's oftentimes a challenge, even once you have standards, to keep them up to date with as quickly as technology is moving. And that's why we're looking towards industry to be having conversations with one another to help us with that interoperability problem. I don't know that it would be wise for us to sit and wait for standards to occur. I sat there in that panel last week and asked all of my former government colleagues and Joe, you too, we need your help, having you've been on this side and you've lived, inside of the government. Now you are in industry. We need your help to challenge internally within your, within the given vendors or within the, within the community there, to drive that interoperability. Because we're not going to arrive at a singular solution. I would turn a very dark shade of blue if I sat here and held my breath waiting for that. So to avoid that, we are calling on industry to work together and work with us to make all of this stuff work together.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, from industry perspective, interoperability is something that is a high priority of focus for us because we understand things like this zero trust architecture. Man, I feel like a broken record at this point when I say that it's not a single solution, right? It's an architecture, it's a direction that we head. So there's going to have to be a stack of products, and you really don't achieve zero trust until those stack of products talk to each other. Otherwise, you just have a whole bunch of independent products that are trying to achieve a point solution problem solving, and it doesn't work well.
That I heard somebody else describe it, although not in this particular context, but a different challenge of describe it like a quilt, right? Like not all of the pieces have to look, not all of the pieces should look the same within a quilt, but they do have to marry up, and you do have to make them work together.
Right. Yeah, that's a great analogy. So as we've had conversations around the industry around interoperability and that stack of solutions. Um, Joe, what do you think are the challenges that industry is having right now to work together to get that interoperability achieved?
Well, you said a stack of products earlier, Josh, and or Steve. And I have to agree. It's going to take a multitude of components to constitute the architecture that we're looking for here. And one of the things that has to occur is for someone who has overall responsibility for the implementation of the architecture to make a choice about which product to use for what function, what role. And that is going to have to be competitive. So one of the challenges right now is as much a challenge for government as it is for industry is how to differentiate the products without blurring the lines of what the role is that we're looking for, and how to conduct a competitive solicitation or acquisition of the right set of products. It's easy to turn to a system integrator and say, it's too hard, you do it, and ask them to make all those choices. But my own personal opinion in the end is if the government does that, it takes too much risk on the system integrator misunderstanding the requirement or making the wrong choice about individual technology selections. And from that perspective, I think it's necessary to pursue this iteratively. The Thunderdome work that DISA is doing right now is a first step. It doesn't even seek to satisfy the entirety of the requirement. And DISA knew that going into it. Industry is going to be challenged to keep up with the evolution of the requirement as government and industry figure it out together through an iterative approach. That's my opinion.
And Joe, I appreciate you making that comment that Thunderdome is not intended to solve everything, right? That's been our strong position from the beginning, and it's been wonderful and heartwarming to watch how it is taken off, and there's so much interest in it. But I also get a little nervous at the same time that folks are possibly looking at it as it's going to solve it. Once implemented, sweet, zero trust, we can go home. Everything's good. And it is certainly not. We know there's a lot of gaps. We had to sit back and, as we were formulating the OTA, we had to create some boundaries. There was only so much that we could do and test in a given period. So I do appreciate you making that comment.
And Steve, as I hear you say that, it's done, we can go home. I keep saying how much zero trust architecture is going to end up as the strategy and a direction that we head. It's going to evolve, right? Because even though we firmly believe this is the security wave of the future, we spent 30 years thinking that perimeter-based network security was the wave of the future. Like, this is what we have to do. It is the constant war games of security and matching adversaries' capabilities. And so, unfortunately, and I don't think any of us are ever going to get to shake our hands and go home. That's just the nature of what we do. So, kind of speaking to that concept of Thunderdome and what's expected of it and what's not expected of it, how do you see privileged access management fitting into the overall objectives of Thunderdome?
So, right now, we're working to figure out how we're going to shape this, and I think the privileged access side, we had attached it more to our ICAM work in the past, and now we're working to how do we pull some of that around into the Thunderdome side. One of the areas that Thunderdome does not actually address at the moment, where we sort of very purposely stopped, was on the data side and the data attributes and making decisions around the data attribute side of things. So really, it stops effectively at about the application layer, or well, just before the application layer. So there are obviously privileged users that have to access those devices. I forget, I can't recall what we call that set of devices. I think it's the customer edge security stack, or application layer security stack in our architecture. So there's a lot of privileged user requirements that are around there, and that's where we're looking towards our ICAM office and working with them to tie a lot of that stuff in. So
Okay. So Steve, I'm gonna throw this back to you for just a second. What are the key cybersecurity initiatives you're planning to tackle in the next 12 months, other than Thunderdome, and why?
Oh, you took my answer away. I was going to go Thunderdome. So there are a few. So besides Thunderdome, which is probably what certainly is the largest, we're looking at a number of places, where we've had, where we have architectures in general. Some of those perimeter capabilities. I apologize. I'm dancing a little bit because there's other things. Let's talk for a moment about asset management. And when we talk about that, we've got a program called Cyber Asset Inventory Management, which is a place where we are looking. It started out from an area looking at how we could patch systems more quickly and more effectively. It came through our work with DIU, the Defense Innovation Unit out in California. We landed on this project that we call CAME, and the idea is not necessarily to add another agent to machines, but it's actually more around how do we leverage a lot of those systems that are already out there, whether it be our EPO or HPSS systems, the Active Directories, network mapping, all that sort of thing, to build a complete picture of what the asset story on the network actually looks like. And then we think longer term, we can start to plug that. I knew I'd bring this right around the Thunderdome, but we're looking to plug that, eventually into Thunderdome, although they are separate efforts right now. But we could see that capability ultimately feeding the access. The access decisions that go on with Thunderdome. Another one we've obviously touched on in here is ICAM. We're going to continue to build and refine our ICAM capability. We've got we're servicing millions of authentication requests per day right now, and we're looking at how we can continue to grow that and make that stronger.
Awesome, thank you for that, Joe. Kind of to put a cap on that question. What do you see, maybe from an industry perspective, that agencies aren't considering, but that they should be looking at in the next 12 months?
Thanks. I was saying that's a hard question, Josh, because frankly, it's been my observation that even if you don't expect it, there's very likely is somebody thinking about it. Right. From that perspective, on the near term, some of the things that I think people will pursue as a priority will be the implementation of modernized infrastructures through the use of commercial solutions for classified, and the movement of traditional top-level architecture security stacks from physical racks of servers into virtualized environments. Those are, in fact, some of the piece parts of what is behind Steve's comment on the application level security stack and how it should be implemented. I think in the longer term, from my personal perspective, there's a lot of room for development around what the United States Cyber Command is calling the Joint Cyber Warfighting Architecture. And if you start from the understanding that there's three basic kinds of cyber missions, the offensive cyber operations, defensive cyber operations and DoDIN operations. The existing joint cyber warfighting architecture is focused predominantly on the first two, in alignment with the mission that is given to what we call the cyber mission force, which is relatively small compared to the overall cyber operations force, which is inclusive of all of the people doing things like DISA equips them to do in cybersecurity service provision, what we call CSSPs, and organizations responsible for installing, operating, and maintaining pieces of the DoDIN. And in that area, I think there's some room for improvement in the coherence of aspects of the joint cyber warfighting architecture around sensors and what it takes to command and control and operate the DoDIN. There's work ongoing to command and control offensive and defensive cyber operations, but it's not as coherently connected, in my opinion, to what it takes to command and control the folks who are doing the installation, operation, and maintenance of the DoDIN. And by maintenance, I include the security function in that. So it's still essential to an overall cybersecurity solution.
Okay. Joe, I'm going to stick with you for just a second. Do you have any words of advice for someone or for an agency that's just starting their PAM journey?
Yeah, I think as you think about it, start by trying to envision how you're going to conduct that set of things necessary to verify explicitly, as we talk about in the principles of the Zero Trust reference architecture. How are you going to verify explicitly that users are who they say they are, and that they should, in fact, have access to know or do the things they say they want to access or do?
Okay, great. Steve, I'll come back to you. I'll let you kind of capstone that question and just add on any words of advice for agencies that are working on their ICAM or Thunderdome strategy.
Sure. So agree with everything that Joe said, and I'd probably add on kind of to a comment that I made earlier about just being mindful of that, the potential for that bad day and needing some level of that flexibility in there in the event of a crisis, right? Design with some of that in mind versus, an absolute lockdown and an extremely fragile sort of system. In terms of where we are going, where with ICAM and Thunderdome, there's or I'm sorry, words of advice for ICAM and Thunderdome. I will tell you where I've watched a lot of folks struggle over the years, specifically around ICAM. There's not enough focus paid to the attribute, as I mentioned earlier, the timeliness and the validity of those attributes. If you're trying to make decisions on things, you got to make sure they're coming from solid sources, that they're constantly updated, that they're reliable, that you have a generally agreed to schema across the whole set. The technology is frankly not that hard. It's been around for quite a while, and a couple of decades at least. That ability to make those attribute decisions. But it's where I've watched people fall down many times over the years is either trying to roll everything up to an enterprise sort of perspective, and then you're fighting at the enterprise level over that schema and how things are laid out, which is very problematic. Joe mentioned earlier about federation, and I see more and more of that being the reality. That do you really need a singular approach within an organization? Does a federated approach actually serve everyone better? You got to worry about licensing and that kind of thing at that point, so you're not paying for the same users 6 times over. But that's between you and your vendors to sort of work out. So that's probably the biggest word of advice on the ICAM side. On the Thunderdome side, set your expectations early. I tried to stress earlier that Thunderdome isn't the be all end all, and it's a journey. It's not a there's no planting a flag here. Because I've heard it many times is we'll have zero trust in 3 years. You're not going to have zero trust in 3 years. I promise you that. And even so, there's another place where you can get too rigid with your policy sets and risk locking your users out if those conditions change or not, and creating a very poor user experience, and sending them out of band, if you will, to go conduct their business on, name your favorite web-based email platform, commercial email platform that isn't in your environment. So you effectively send them out of bounds just so that they can get their jobs done. So awesome, you secured the system so well that you denied valid access to the things that the users need to have access to. So I would just stress flexibility, and don't look for the big bang. Look for the small wins along the way, and how are you actually making it better, not just in the security side, but also focus on that user experience too. It is just as important in my mind as the security side.
Awesome. Thank you for that. So just closing thoughts, words of wisdom or advice that you have on any of the topics we've talked about today. Joe, I'll start with you.
Yeah, so kind of to put a wrapper on this from my perspective, Josh, I think understand that we're not starting from scratch. You have an existing infrastructure. You've got to make very tough decisions about what to modernize, what to replace. And yeah, you have to do that in a way which optimizes your ability to use the available resources. Secondly, I think it's appropriate to take the view that Steve was expressing, that we kind of have to expect this to be a federated architecture. There's not going to be one agency that develops one solution that just gets used by everybody. There's going to, for a number of reasons, be multiple implementations. It's going to be very important for those to be interoperable. And as Steve mentioned earlier, part of that is going to be the adoption of standards, and it'll be the responsibility of some organization to set those standards where it's possible to do so. But for the reason that he expressed, part of this is still requirement being discovered. The standards for requirements yet to be discovered haven't been developed yet. So that is going to have to be part of the experience. And then from my own personal perspective, aspirationally, what I would like to see emerge in this entire realm of the implementation of a zero trust reference architecture is to make it more continuous, and to tie in what can be gleaned from the use of analytics and automation and orchestration, two of the pillars of the zero trust reference architecture, in order to feed back into the other pillars information that can be used to make better decisions on a continuous basis, such as potentially incorporating information about user activity in the decision making about as one of the factors in a multi-factor solution for whether they should continue to have access to what they're asking to do or no. And if you then extend that paradigm to devices, we can make similar decisions about what the device is doing, which may be independent of what the user on it is instructing it to do, and whether that device should remain connected or continue to have access to the networks it's going to have access to. That's a device activity monitoring paradigm, and that can be extended to aggregate information about a much larger network. And in the aggregate, network activity monitoring is something that can reveal insights that we could use, which could cause us to think, should we change our policies with regard to what we're trying to do in the management of users and devices or network control devices? And then extend that one further and understand that some applications, the application pillar being the fourth of the four that I've gone through here, some applications are as realistically a user of the network as the humans that interact through some form of console. And you have to build credentials for them. You have to go through a mechanism to determine what privileges they should have and control that. And you can observe the activity of applications longitudinally in order to wrap insights about application activity monitoring back into decisions in all four of those pillars. So in my mind, turning that into a real-time continuous decision-making cycle is the kind of the ultimate objective.
Okay. Thank you for that. That's some great information. Steve, closing thoughts.
So first, appreciate you all having us here today. These are always a lot of fun. I agree with a lot of what Joe said there, and I think probably one of the things that gets overlooked, and going back to my comments about the user experience is, we before it was zero trust, remember we always talked about least privileged, right? So you're likely not starting from scratch as it is. A lot of folks look at this whole zero trust thing and they look up at it and they're like, holy cow, where do I have to go from here? I've got to scale this giant mountain. The reality is you've been doing a lot of these principles for some time. However, you've typically been doing them with just the user in mind. Now you're adding in all of these other aspects of that session. And whether that's the privileged user or whether that's your general, your gen pop user, if you will, you're starting to add in a lot of other things, of attributes about that user session. So perhaps, and maybe a little bit more focused on the user side, where you would have just made a binary decision on whether the user had a valid credential or not in the past. Perhaps you allow them to shift to a different credential. You apply additional challenges. You take the other things, the other attributes about that session into mind when making a decision whether to allow access or even tailoring the user's experience based around the credential that they may have used or something like that. It opens up a lot more in terms of opportunities rather than that traditional, binary, I'm going to let you in or I'm not going to let you in sort of thing.
Right. Thank you for that. Yeah, that's definitely a good way to approach that thinking that we've been headed in this direction for a while. We've changed the name of it. We've added some things to it, but we certainly aren't starting from the beginning. Gentlemen, I really appreciate your time today. I appreciate Carasoft and Deepwater Point letting me moderate this fireside chat.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like more information on how Carasoft or Beyond Trust can assist your organization, please visit www.carasoft.com or email us at beyondtrust@carasoft.com. Thanks again for listening and have a great day.